Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the second in our four talks on the relationship between art and Christianity. In the second of these series on art and Christianity, I want us to fast forward beyond the life of the early church and its emergence, and the emergence of Christianity as an established religion in Europe. Our first discussion group 2 weeks ago focused on Roman citizens like Junius Bassus choosing to emphasize their Christian faith in works of burial art. We think of Junius Bassus. This is a Roman politician who, on his funerary monument, on his sarcophagus, inscribed various scenes from the Bible and the lives of Jesus Christ and the saints. We're moving away from that depiction of Christianity in early art, the art of the 6th and 7th centuries, focusing instead today on a more understandable and perhaps more relatable depiction of art and Christianity in the Renaissance. What then do we see as we set the clock spinning through the centuries following Christianity's established place in Europe and beyond as a religion of record, which caught the attention not only of Roman citizens, of those at Ephesus, of those at Corinth, those various early centers of Christianity that we read about in the New Testament, and indeed across the wider world. A basic lesson in art history shows us gradual changes and developments in art in two distinctive ways. First, as we begin to move towards the modern era, towards the Renaissance, towards some of the familiar artwork that we know and love, is a change in materials and a change in form. By the time of the Renaissance in Italy, with its beginnings really in the 13th century, the germ of the Renaissance in the 13th century, and then its apex, its height in the 15th and 16th centuries, murals and funerary monuments of the past are giving way to frescoes, to oil paintings, to altarpieces. Artists, by this point in the Renaissance, have emerged as tradespeople in their own right, as courtiers in their own right, and are discovering new ways of depicting their subjects and their biblical scenes. In 1125, the monk Theophilus Presbyter writes his treatise on oil-based painting. And it's sometimes thought that oil-based painting was the invention of the Dutch masters, actually many centuries later than the 12th century. If you read the famous book, some of you will know this, the famous book by Vasari, The Lives of the Early Painters. If you read about the Renaissance through more traditional authors, traditional art historians, you will find the prevailing view that oil-based painting, in other words, the oil-based paintings of we think of the Michelangelos, we think of the Raphaels, we think of all of these famous painters of the Renaissance. It was actually an invention of a much earlier period of church history and art history. So 1125, we have the emergence for the first time of a written down work telling us about the use of oil in painting. At this early time, it would almost certainly have been what artists term tempera-based artwork, oil painting on wood panels, for example, on the reredos of a high altar in a Romanesque church, in the church of the 12th, 13th centuries. But the Renaissance is celebrated almost everywhere by art historians because of the gradual moving away from wood-panelled work to an emphasis on wet techniques like fresco. Fresco, which we associate with Michelangelo, where paint is put onto wet lime plaster. So the immediate example that might come to our minds, those who have gone on pilgrimage to Rome, Sistine Chapel, Michelangelo's magnum opus in many ways. The idea of putting oil onto wet plaster, onto a completely different sort of material compared to the past. It's in this later phase of the Renaissance that we begin to encounter some of our most famous biblical Western world painters, such as Titian, such as Giovanni Bellini, Michelangelo, as I mentioned, amongst others. So that's the first development that I want us to think about a little bit today when we examine art in relationship to our faith, in relationship to biblical scenes and ideas. It's that development of resources, that change that allows us to look at the scenes very differently, look at the personalities of our faith differently. The second development is linked to the first. Perspective, form, detail in the art itself, a change, if you like, in attitude. We see in the very early wood-panelled art of, for example, the 12th and 13th centuries, a two-dimensional space in which biblical characters are depicted, like the Virgin Mary, like St. John the Baptist, and St. Peter. Those are probably the three most popular examples. Two-dimensional space, flat painting on wood, somewhat odd and almost ugly to the modern eye. You go to the National Gallery, you journey around, you go around to the front of the Salisbury wing, and you look at the very, very early examples of Renaissance art, you will notice that the wood paste oil paintings are very flat. They're very flat, and they're not particularly, they don't align very well with modern aesthetic sensibilities, because today we're so used to perspective and depth of vision. You think about, how much, for example, photographic technology has developed, and depth of field, color, use of color, perspective. All of those things make it a little bit odd when we look at this very two-dimensional religious artwork. But as we move forward in time, perspective emerges in our oil-based paintings in particular. And sometimes this is accounted for by art historians, by the widespread use of the technique of camera obscura, the development of the scientific methods used in the late Middle Ages and in the Renaissance to project images onto screens from a pinhole camera, the invention of the pinhole camera, which centuries later leads to the invention of photography as we know it today. But whether we look at the science or not, the point that I make is that there was a psychological development in the Renaissance with regards to art. It wasn't just one technique, but like I said, a change in attitude. When we think about the Renaissance, we're thinking about a change of the way in which artists relate to their subjects and to the Christian scenes that they're depicting. Artists begin to think in the Renaissance about the depiction of art very differently, a little like moving from black and white television to color television. There's a shift in the way in which we think about what we see in front of our eyes and the way in which we depict important images. With those 2 points beared in mind then, that sort of brief whirlwind tour around art history and its development over several centuries since our first talk, I want us to spend a short while looking at this piece of art by Gaudenzio Ferrari called Christ's Rising from the Tomb, very fitting in our season of Easter tide. It was painted between 1530 and 1546, and so it represents a culmination of the artistic developments of the Renaissance, away from flatter 2D images and limited wood-based materials towards a more mature, perspective-based way of painting. Some of the earlier artistic techniques actually do survive in this painting, which is one of the reasons why I've selected it. It is still based on wood, poplar wood, and not on canvas. Many of us, when we go around the National Gallery, or any other art museum of record in this country and abroad, will always note that the legend, the text underneath the painting, gives us a clue as to what it was painted on. Oil on canvas, oil on poplar wood, or whatever it might be. And so here we kind of see it joining up the dots in some of the ways in which art galleries depict art. This painting is in the National Gallery. So if you ever get the opportunity to look at the late Renaissance paintings, religious paintings at the National Gallery, you will find several examples of Ferraris. I don't mean the car, for those who have just joined us. I'm talking about the author of the painting, the painter. Ferrari was a very famous became a very famous guy. I'm lamenting but bringing that up now. Ferrari is a very classic example of late Renaissance painting. So National Gallery has several works of his, this one included. So do go and see it if you ever get the opportunity to do so. But it's oiled on poplar wood. But we see the use of perspective, looking more closely at what's set before us now. And the brushstroke detailing, which is possible in the later phase of oil painting in the Renaissance, is evident. The use of brushstroke detailing to emphasize or de-emphasize things in what is being painted. And what's the subject? What's going on here? Here is Christ risen from the dead, with a sense of pageant, of triumph, clear from the get-go. The swirling of his robes in that sense of state, and his standing somewhat aloof but powerful over the world scene, that countryside, rather arid countryside scene that's set behind him. As we look at this scene, I think we can draw out today, as a group together, 3 questions. First of all, what types of architecture, what types of object, depictions in this scene help us to identify the time in which it was painted? And I'll remind you of those dates: 1530, 1546, mid-16th century. That's our first question we might want to consider. How does this depiction of Christ place itself in a particular cultural sphere, particular place and time? And how is Christ himself shown in this scene in comparison to some of the earlier depictions we saw 2 weeks ago, where Christ is always locked away in a particular chapter and verse scene of the Bible? Christ risen, Christ being on trial before Pontius Pilate, Christ transfigured. What makes this kind of thing different from those very biblical scene-based depictions of the past, of earlier on? And thirdly, are there elements of this painting that still seem underdeveloped, strange, unnatural to us? I was speaking earlier about how 2-dimensional images can seem unnatural to us in art. I just want us to pause for a moment before I continue and see if any of us have words that they can share with the group that speak to us and share with us about what we see in front of us under those 3 headings.
Is the date anything to do with the flag, that when states became states? Or...
So the flag is a popular motif of Christ's rising from the dead, and you'll see this particular ensign, if you like, that's held up by Christ in a lot of depictions of Renaissance art and earlier art. I was involved with a passion play several years ago, and one of these symbols that they used at the death of Christ was this rising of the ensign, this rising of the banner of Christ's victory over death, that then mirrored up to his resurrection scene. So this flag is a very popular symbol of Christ's resurrection.
Even
it looks a little bit like, sorry, carry on.
Red Cross is a symbol of the man.
Indeed. It's a very interesting standard. I always think it makes everything look a little bit like St. George's Day.
Exactly, St. George being one of the...
What about this pavement, this structure that Christ seems to be standing on? What do we make of that? It is a tomb, yeah.
Using the stone, like it's not the tomb that place is not. Look at the picture carefully. It's not a tomb.
Actually, yes, we'll write it is. What is it, John?
The act between life and death.
Okay, that's one answer. Edge between life and death.
Yes, and he stepped on it, and he's crossing. That's not the tomb. He's
Very
going the wrong way around.
I think he's climbing out into the world,
Okay.
because you've got the mountains in the background.
No, it's Ferrari. It's
Ferrari.
Yeah.
But I always thought that the wound in the side was under his heart, and not on the other side.
Yes, that's interesting, isn't
As
it?
though that everything's wrong. If you're talking about the camera effect, they were looking at whatever they were seeing in the negative. So you look at Caravaggio's,
Yes.
all of them are the wrong way around. Because he's looking at them
In a
inverted
lens.
through a lens, and in a way, this is Jesus the wrong way around.
Very good. Excellent. So we have, for the benefit of people listening online, we have the idea that the camera obscura that gives us the sense of perspective in the painting has, in effect, flipped around some of the attributes on Christ's body. For example, the wound being on his on the wrong side, partly on his left, under the ventricle of his heart. It's on the right. John has talked about this pavement, these two pavements separated underneath by Christ's feet, being a representation between life and death. I think there's also something to be remarked upon here in terms of style. This is a very this is almost a rather sort of Baroque style of architectural depiction here at the bottom of this pavement. You know, we think back to the life of Christ and the setting of Christ's earthly ministry. Okay, we can think about Roman Empire. We can think about the architectural traditions of the Mediterranean at the time of Christ's ministry. But this is a rather Baroque, a rather arch, a rather more contemporary piece of architecture, which I think possibly brings it a little bit more into line with Ferrari's idiom of the 16th century.
If he's climbing out of the tomb, he's got no visible marks except a slight mark on his chest. But he hasn't got.
So is it?
There's one more mark. Where is it?
And then it's the third.
On the boat. Yeah,
A little bit, yeah.
yeah. But it's not a really gory depiction.
No, it's not
Say
like
that.
blood everywhere.
You're right to say that.
It's stylized.
I think that's a really important thing to tease out. It is stylized. What about his head? What have we got going on there?
And he's leaning to one side.
Is there anything around his head? It's a halo. Yeah. Yeah. But this time much more subtle compared to the halos of saints and of Christ and the disciples in more early Christian art, and particularly in the art of the West, particularly the art of the Byzantine tradition, where halos are emphasized, halos which bring us back to that idea of the transfiguration and the transfiguration of Christ's followers as well as his own transfiguration. So really interesting to see that element placed more into the background rather than emphasized. The emphasis here being on the whole way in which Christ carries himself. That sense of state, that sense of glory and pageant, which is quite classical with a capital C, classical in sort of development of the Baroque tradition, the slightly more flamboyant tradition that you see emerge by the 16th century, 17th century too.
He's also in a position you'd expect, or at least a condition you'd expect, having been washed, but there's no evidence that the women were able to wash him before he was put in the tomb because they didn't have time.
Yeah.
And they were coming on Easter morning in order to do exactly that. So he should have been covered in blood, he should have been gory, and the wounds should have been more obvious.
Oh, he's God, he can do anything.
Oh, yeah, but the point is, you know, he does look as though he's just come out of a morning shower, doesn't he? With head and shoulders and everything else working perfectly well, or whatever shampoo you're going to use. He looks utterly clean and untainted.
Maybe the angel actually not.
Well, if he was going to be totally, he wouldn't have any wings.
Well, it's not realistic, is it? The painting, it's not realistic.
Well, it's meant to be, isn't it?
Why do you say that, Jane?
Well, because if it was realistic, as you said, he might have the injuries in his hands and feet and side
would be more enunciated?
pronounced. Not, so it's not a realistic depiction, is it? When it was said that, or interpreted that that this is the halo, it also can be seen as a shroud.
I think Marilyn Monroe would be the wings.
So we've got here something that is, sorry, yes.
Is there also what you were saying about previous art being depictions of scenes from the Bible? This isn't necessarily an actual, this is something that, this isn't an actual scene from.
Spot on.
from the
Yeah,
Bible.
absolutely right. That was going to be the point.
Yeah.
Andres, sorry.
I just wanted to ask, is there any analysis done on, because if you look at the banner, it very much looks like the banner has been added, either post-production or late framing. It's not a natural holding of the banner.
No, it is.
It's an addition. You have to look at the staff that's holding the banner, which is very geopolitically strengthening Christianity. It's not there. It's an after addition to it.
That's a very good question, and one that I don't have the answer to.
But can you iterate what's been said?
Yes, no, indeed. So the question that's been asked is whether the banner, whether the standard being held by Christ is a later edition, is something that is, if you like, something of a more political gesture that doesn't necessarily belong to this original depiction of Christ risen from the dead. Like I said earlier, it's a popular thematic. It's a popular theme that emerged in a lot of Renaissance art to have the banner carried, the standard carried. And it is political insofar as it represents the triumph of Christianity in a sort of ideological sense over the triumph of death, the banner of death, the representation of death. One of the things I would suggest we look at here is actually the background. The countryside, if you like, the rocky valley, the valley of the shadow of death, if you like. Yeah, indeed. As John was saying earlier, we see this great contrast between the valley of the shadow of death, the gloomy background of this painting, and then the bright colour and the triumph of the standard of Christ's gesture, of Christ's robes, of Christ standing up and climbing out into the world. So these sharp distinctions. Yeah.
What did Cameron say?
Cameron was talking about the whole depiction of Christ here is much more like a subject being depicted in a painting that we might see in the secular world compared to just a biblical scene like we might encounter in this space in the Memorial Chapel in our stained glass, or in those early depictions of biblical scenes on funerary monuments of the first few centuries AD. This is a point that I wanted to enunciate, so thank you for saying that. Because we see as we move forward in time in the art of the Western world in particular, but not just in the Western world, a focus on the characters of our biblical tradition and of Christ and of God that are just the figures themselves, the subjects that prompt us to think about our relationship to them as Christians, rather than just something that we can go and find in a textual format or in an oral tradition in the Bible. And that segues into a point that I want to make as we move towards the end of our conversations about spirituality and what we see or perhaps what we don't see. Spiritually, how can we invest in Ferrari's famous depiction here of the Easter story, or the depiction of the famous Easter story, I think.
Is he saying, I am risen? Is that why he said, I'm trying to just, what's the message of this picture? That's what I'm trying to work out.
So the message of this picture, well, what do you think the message of the picture?
Well, I think he's saying, hello to the world, I am risen.
I think that's right.
I don't know.
I think that's right.
But is it not also the Holy Spirit? Because the shroud is wrapped around with there's a feeling there must be a wind that's taking the flag, taking the shroud, and
Mm.
It's as though it's the spirit coming out of the depths of the earth. If John is correct, this is the
Yes.
Helen's.
And I think very much we can look at the if you like the cloud of the Holy Spirit, or rather the voice of the God speaking from the cloud, if we remember that transfiguration scene, being an extension here of the halo around him. So really interesting to see actually how lots of these images are tied together. Let me just continue for a moment to speak about spirituality, because I think that might help bring some of these observations, all of which have been extremely good, together.
Going into spirituality, it's also, I think we can understand from the word, in terms of the period where it is, which period it's from, is the leg length is not realistic. So it's very typical of late Renaissance. It's actually a bit tall for a male. That actually it should be, it is. The background is also like depicted, but in a bit obscure way.
Yeah.
So it's also another like really remark of the Renaissance art. And on top of it, is this the index finger? If you look at his toes, this one is taller than this one.
Yeah.
For some, it could be the other way, but that was the beauty standards of Renaissance. So if you look at all the Renaissance paintings, you would see that this toe, which is, I don't think,
Index finger.
this one is, how do you say, this finger basically is,
The index finger.
is taller than this one. Sorry, just wanted to add,
No, thank you for that. So we've just speaking about the proportions of the body that map onto the ideas of beauty in Renaissance art, and how in this painting the length of fingers, the length of the torso in respect to the legs is not proportionate in the way in which more contemporary art would be. Just before we open up to the floor again, I just want to make one or two remarks upon spirituality and art. So how can we see spirituality, not just in this painting, but in others? How can we use it to support this painting? How can we use it to support, challenge, or enliven our Christian faith? Christ is, in the words of Vincent van Gogh, making men instead of statues, and is a kind of artist for us in his own right. So in the Easter story, he is theologically and spiritually putting our lives back together by restoring friendship with God. That's the theology, that's the sermon, if you like. And he encourages us all, Christ encourages us, Son of God, to be builders of our own faith, to be master builders, in the words of St. Paul, working in the power of the Spirit in his kingdom, a theme that's relevant to our feast of Philip and James today, examples of those builders of the faith of the early church. The art of Renaissance begins to shape our understanding of our faith, not simply by teaching us biblical scenes or themes, and this is where the point that we heard earlier comes in, but by glorifying Christ as a man, as God. We are glimpsing something about our Christian identity here when we move into the realm of the Renaissance world. Ferrari's painting today, which was not apparent 2 weeks ago, has this gesture of the Christian identity that I think is much more potent than we might have seen with the tomb of Junius Bassus, the sarcophagus that just has scene by scene by scene, like we see in our stained glass in church here. In the weeks to come, as we continue our journey forward in time towards the present, we will see this examination of self in biblical and Christian art develop further. Self, the person of Christ, there he is, speaking to us, gesturing to us, as Jane correctly put it, making a gesture to us as Christians. That will develop further. It will move in the modern era into more psychological territory. If we can glorify and celebrate Christ, what about doubt? What about the struggles of our day-to-day lives that do not always map onto our faith, our worship, our sense of Christian hope? We see in the Renaissance a beginning of that psychology, which is important. Art here is no less potent than the written word, a poem, or a letter to a dear friend. The gesture being made is personal. Of course, you might disagree. You might think this speaks to me not at all. What are you talking about, Aunt William? Art and Christianity are important important. Joining these two ideas, if you like, joining together, are important because they teach us about the history of a Christian struggle with faith. One of the themes I'm trying to tease out over these talks is how we can get from a position where Christians only really talk about their faith as it maps directly and logically and almost syllogistically onto the Bible. This scene, this theme, this scene. We move from a position of that sort through the Renaissance, through the modern era of art, to a place where artists today, and I take artists in broad strokes here, artists including poets, including writers, including those who video and record and do all of these things that we do today, how they can now feel they have the freedom to express their faith almost in every kind of way imaginable, according to human psychology, human technology, human cultural self-expression, and the liberal culture which can furnish that sense of expression. How do we move from those two things, get from that position of A to B and to C beyond? How do we represent Christian struggle with faith and the ways in which they choose to express human hopes and fears, these artists, as they bring themselves before the Lord and as they bring themselves before his loving grace? We have here a somewhat middle point on that journey, where no longer does art need to be trapped within the text, within the oral traditions that have been handed on by the early church. We see the beginnings of the depictions of beauty, of the depictions of the artist's own emphasis, the artistic rubbing off of his cultural background that we see in art, materials, form, style. Okay. So really interesting to see in the Renaissance. And I use this example, I've deliberately used an example that's less familiar today. I've done that deliberately because I want us to encounter a sense of curiosity. I want us to demonstrate a sense of curiosity with something that we don't know, although parts of it will be known because we've seen more famous examples of the same painting, same depictions of Jesus Christ, same depictions of Mary, same depictions of other biblical scenes and characters. Here we see a development and progress. We see humanity coming to terms with God and Christ and salvation in ways that we will relate to, in ways that we will sympathize with, also in ways that will seem simplistic, also in ways that we will find boring or bizarre, which are perfectly legitimate expressions when it comes to art vis-a-vis our faith. I'm going to stop talking there, and I'd like us, if we have any questions about this piece of art, about the Renaissance more generally, or about art and Christianity more generally, just to spend maybe 5 minutes now, if there are any yearning and burning questions before.
Where is this painting at the moment?
This painting is in the National Gallery.
In the National Gallery.
So this painting is part of the sort of the middle and late phase of the Renaissance section in the permanent exhibition.
Prolific artist.
Yes, Ferrari was a very prolific artist. Think in terms of, think of the Michelangelos of the world and the Raphaels of the world. Yes.
Well, I like this art, this drawing, because it represents Jesus is saying, I am the one, I defeat death, cleanse from death, no marks, and you have to pick up the cross daily and follow me.
Right.
And you have to put the world behind you and lift up yourself daily.
Excellent. So it's resonating strongly with that victory over death. The call of the Christian, or the drawing to Christ of the Christian.
So what do we think, when we talked about the picture, but what do you think that Jesus, in his facial expression, is actually saying? Because I can't see it. I'm looking at it, is he looking, he's not looking triumphant, he's compassionate. What do you think that Ferrari was wanting us to think that Jesus was?
What do we think that Ferrari wants us to think to reflect on in the face, in the expression of Jesus in this painting? When I first saw this painting, the expression of Jesus reminded me of that very famous Da Vinci enigmatic sort of slightly placid smile of the Mona Lisa. The idea of avoiding the avoiding the profane and the vulgar through a expression of complete delight and ecstatic sort of happiness, but rather a sort of wistful, slightly placid expression, which prevents us from thinking that he's upset or he's nervous or he's judgmental or any of these sort of emotional psychological things. I think there is a very wistful and very quietly triumphant expression on Jesus.
I think he looks a bit resigned. I thought that's the word, yeah, that's what I.
Resigned.
Perhaps we see the entirety of human sin, which is what he's supposed to have done on the
It
cross.
doesn't look very happy.
It's actually seen it.
I just think to pure.
Yeah.
So we've got, so yeah, so
Did it not meet up with the point that was made earlier, because this is the depiction of beauty at the time?
yes, I think that's, yes, the depiction of beauty being relevant here.
I'm saying about Mona Lisa, the point
Yeah.
is
I think that's right.
Christ is most beautiful as of the like I said, very baroque, almost cherubim style.
Which is why I emphasize the Leonardo da Vinci example. I think, thinking about the ways in which artists at their time depicted emotions which we share today.
That's a demure. Demure. I mean, that's the thing about Da Vinci. It's the Mona Lisa is demure. It's the picture of what
I think it's
Middle Ages saw of the woman as being.
Yeah. I'm not saying it's an exact analogy, but it's approximate.
There's no masculinity in this picture.
I just.
There's no of triumph, and but there is almost a sense of bloody hell, look what's happened.
I just think it's
In
representing
fact,
purity and simpleness. I just think it's representing purity and simpleness.
but he's seen also on the cross, he took on the sin of humanity. It's almost as though he's been completely marked by that.
Any other thoughts? Yes.
With regard to the face, it is kind of ambiguous, and about a Renaissance. I'm not born in the Renaissance, like I really like the rest of the body is like there is a triumphant purity and everything. Like his hand is posed like that, and then he has the banner as well. Like this is the conquest of Britain.
So there is an expression, your point that you're making is that there is an expression of triumph in the poise and the pose of the body, but that's communicated less in the face. Is that okay?
Like
Fine.
he's won an Oscar.
I think the expression in the image is, as the old theology, it's I am, which is the same theology Jesus used.
Exactly.
Okay.
That's the expression.
Yes, the expression of the I am, the again that sense of the identity of the Son of Man and of us who look at him.
There's no such thing as to be.
Any other comments?
There are some other similarities to Leonardo da Vinci. That's Tomato at the background. It reminds me of Madonna at the mountains. You know that?
Yes, indeed, yeah. Okay, so that's similarity to other works of Da Vinci. Okay, interesting. Very good. Any other burning remarks? Or yearning and exciting and burning with the fire of the spirit, I should say. So,
Looks a bit sad, I think.
It's like,
It doesn't look very happy that he saved the world and he's out of the tomb,
or out
I
of-
think he'd be more joyous in a way.
can you think, just as a sort of to play devil's advocate, can you think of a famous painting that you know of any period where Jesus in a resurrection scene like this is smiling,
No.
as in smiling in the way that we smile when we open the wine for the paraclet.
There's one of.
Just to play devil's advocate here.
There's one of of seeing Mary in the garden and he's smiling at her. Can't remember. And there's death, but it's not on his own and not smiling. It's only okay. I just scored a goal or whatever it is. I just won the cup. But
Okay, but it's much more.
it's mostly in interactions with others and post resurrection. But there's not much of him smiling beforehand either. As far as I can recall.
No one smiles in the Renaissance art, like truly smiles. It's in secular painting as well, portraits.
Indeed, yeah.
It's a draw. It's not
This is oil.
Yeah.
Oh, but is this, usually it's with oil.
This is in oil, yes, this is oil on wood. So this is one of the late examples of oil on wood before we start to see canvas art emerge in a much more widespread way. Yeah.
It's telling me, raise my banner and praise the Lord.
Raise my banner high and praise the Lord. Thank you, Prophet. I think those are possibly good words to conclude on today, although of course if there are any other questions.
How big is this painting?
How big?
I mean,
That-
is it very big or?
Yeah, this is a big, it's really big.
Quite.
This is like, I think it's about, I think it's about 80, not quite 80 inches tall.
And where was it before the National Gallery acquired it?
That's a very good question. It's been in the National Gallery a long time.
We probably still do somehow.
Yeah.
Or have it. There's
It goes on tour, I think. It's been in the Met.
No, we don't.
I mean, I wondered if it was painted for a specific.
It wasn't painted for the
These
for the
are
National
one
Gallery.
gallery.
No, it was, that's a question I forget maybe. I don't know the answer to that question, but I will get it for you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you very much.
And next time we will be looking at contemporary, by which I mean modern and postmodern depictions of art. We're going to be looking at first of all, 19th century art, that theme of doubt and Christianity emerging in art, particularly in the authors and the artists themselves. And then our final session, our fourth session, will be on the art and stained glass that we see in our church, looking at the things that we see here and how they can connect and join some of the dots for the reflections we've been making.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
No, I'm not ambitious at all.